this is something I can do, and this is something I'm highly motivated to do, highly self-motivated. No one has to drag me out of bed at 6 o'clock to go to my desk. I'm there.
Hello and welcome, fellow human. My name is Zachary Stockill, and you are listening to Humans in Love, a podcast that looks at culture, relationships, and personal development from unconventional perspectives. Consider it self-improvement that doesn't take itself too seriously. Thanks for being here. Welcome, fellow human. Thank you so much for listening to this, episode 1 of my brand new podcast, Humans in Love. I couldn't be more excited to be speaking to you today and to finally be launching this podcast and getting this new project off the ground. It's been a long time coming. And today's guest will be no stranger to you if you are familiar with my old podcast, Travels in Music. Mark Lewisohn is the world's leading authority on the Beatles. He's the author of Tune In, which is the first volume of his 3, possibly 4-part new biography of the band, which I believe will stand the test of time as the definitive statement on the greatest rock and roll band of all time, the Beatles. And he was also featured on episode 1 of my old podcast, Travels in Music, so I thought it was only appropriate to feature Mark on episode 1 of this new podcast, Humans in Love. In today's interview, we get into all kinds of things about the Beatles, but for me, the most interesting part of the podcast is when we talk about Mark the man, Mark the human being, Mark the world's leading Beatles historian. Like, what is that like? What does that kind of pressure do to you? What are the challenges involved in a project like this? How do you maintain some semblance of work-life balance? For my money, that's the most interesting part of this podcast. And Mark was very frank and very open in my discussion with him. I was traveling in London recently, and he was nice enough to give me some time, and we connected at the British Library. And that conversation is featured in part 1 of today's episode. But part 2, which you can find right now, it's launched today as well, features another Skype conversation that we had about a week ago. So there was more that I wanted to talk about, and I feel like it was too long to put it all in one episode, all of our conversations. So I split this one up into part A and part B. A quick note before we get started, I won't bother you with ads and interruptions during our conversation, but I'll say now, ratings and reviews are absolutely critical for show success in these early days, the first 2 months of launch in particular. So if you enjoy this episode, if you enjoy this show, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a rating and review as soon as you can. Those reviews mean a great deal to me, and they will provide the boost I need to hopefully get on the iTunes new noteworthy charts. So as soon as you can, it would mean a lot to me if you could leave a rating and a review. Another note that we recorded this conversation in what was mostly a quiet hallway at the British Library. But towards the end, there's a little bit of noise, a little bit of background noise, but I did some editing, and I think the sound turned out pretty good overall. So hopefully it'll be okay for you too. Thank you so much for listening, and please enjoy episode 1, featuring part A of my conversation with the world's leading authority on the Beatles, Mr. Mark Lewisohn. Okay, well, we're live. Mark, thank you so much for making time for me today in this corner of the British Library.
That's all right. Nice to find a quiet space for how long it lasts.
It is, yeah. We'll see how long we get. Well, the first thing I'd love to just know about is you went to India recently. Why did you end up there, and what was your trip like?
I went there to participate in the making of a film. Working title The Beatles in India, but it may not ultimately be titled that. And it is principally about the Beatles in India, and mostly therefore about their 1968 visit to Rishikesh, but also we were looking at the Beatles there in 66 and George Harrison's trips in 66 and 68, and John and Yoko were there too in 1969. So we touched upon all of that, but I think the main element of the film will be the Beatles' study of transcendental meditation in Rishikesh, and the film will also look at meditation generally. So it isn't just a Beatles film, it's about what it was that they were looking for. This film is being made by Paul Saltzman, the Canadian filmmaker, who was with the Beatles in Rishikesh in 1968, and has had a long 50-plus year career in films. I believe he's an Emmy Award-winning director, based in Canada still. And this is very much his film about his journey, as well as the Beatles' journey. So he's making the film, and I was with him throughout the trip to India.
I know Paul a little bit. I interviewed him for my last podcast. Yeah, fascinating guy. I might have to try to interview him again about this new film. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be pleased to do that, because it's a subject that's dear to his heart, and the film is being made in the right way by the right people. Paul in particular, but also the other people involved in the making of the film. It seems to be the right kind of project for me to have an involvement with. And what it enabled was me to go to India. Not that I was prevented from going there before, but I just hadn't made the trip. And when I went there for the filming of this movie, it was the right way to go to see it with the right people, and it was a great trip.
Did you make it to Rishikesh?
Oh yes, very much so. Rishikesh was not the only place on the agenda. We went to Delhi and to Mumbai, but we certainly went to Rishikesh, and that for me was the highlight of the trip, because I had it was the strangest thing. Rishikesh occurred in the Beatles' history in 1968, by which point I was 9 going on 10 and very much following what was happening, but seeing it through a child's eyes. A couple of the weekly British music papers, Record Mirror and Disc, had colour photography by then. These newspapers typically were black and white. And because they had colour pictures of the Beatles in India looking so different, I cut them out at the time and kept them in a scrapbook. And so literally for 50 years, I've been looking at those and other pictures of the Beatles there, and I could never quite make any sense of what it was like, really. You know, I just knew it through these photographs and the odd bit of newsreel film. And to actually step into the place, to go to the ashram, to walk around it, to feel its peace, to smell it, to hear it, to see it, to experience it 3D, was quite revelatory, really. And I am, as a writer anyway, keen to go to the places that I write about. And I know now, having been to Rishikesh, that if I hadn't gone, the writing of it would not be as good as I now know it can be. It'll now have an extra dimension that I couldn't have given it had I not been.
That's really interesting to me, that you were so into the Beatles even at that age, and you were conscious of that they were going to India, and like you probably had no idea what meditation was or anything, but there was something that sparked that, hey, that they're doing something interesting here. Well,
the Beatles introduced the word meditation into my vocabulary, as I'm sure they introduced it to many other people's. They were, as I often say of the Beatles, even when they weren't doing things for the first time of anybody, they were popularizing something that had been around a while. So meditation, obviously, is not exactly a new discipline or a new study or a new method of relaxation, but undoubtedly the Beatles doing it made a lot of people aware of it for the first time. But for me, the photographs of Rishikesh, they might as well... I know it was India. I knew it was India. And I knew where India was on the map. And I knew that people could travel, as indeed the Beatles had. They got on an aeroplane and gone there. But I never considered that I could go. Not because it was forbidden to me in any way, but in my head there was this kind of a barrier there that Rishikesh might as well have been on another planet rather than just 8 hours flight away from London. But it isn't on another planet. What it is a beautiful spot above the Ganges, just as it flows out of the Himalayas, in the middle of a tiger reserve, with literally, as I heard with my own ears, the sound of elephants in the background whilst you're walking around the place. Nowhere near home, that's for sure, not for me, but not that far away either. And I needed to realize that there isn't actually a barrier separating it from anywhere else. It's attainable and visitable by anybody.
Did you happen to see monkeys doing it in the road? Because I've seen that many times when I've been to Rishikesh. To me, it's a part of the experience. It's an important part of the experience.
Yeah, I looked, but they wouldn't perform for me. What can I say? But I did meet a monkey. The moment we arrived there, we were. There is now the ashram is now for the first time recognized as being a place where tourists will visit. It has its own. It's now being looked after, and it has an entrance. And if you want to go in it, you have to pay. And that money is used towards its upkeep. And when we arrived, obviously they knew we were coming because it was a film unit. We were garlanded in the traditional Indian manner, and so we were standing there at the gateway, doing an interview on camera, with these garlands of marigolds around our neck, and we'd only been there 5 minutes, and a monkey came up and snatched it off my neck, just literally pulled at the garland sufficiently to break it, and then to tear off into the trees with it and eat it. So I met a monkey almost immediately. They weren't doing it in the road, but they were nicking my flowers.
I was also robbed by a monkey in Rishikesh, walking down the street one day with a bag of bananas, and I felt something tug and it was gone. No one believes me. I swear I was robbed. The monkey literally took my bananas. Yeah. One of the things I've always been very, very interested in is India in the British imagination, particularly after colonialism, after 1947. And as a young person growing up, sort of kind of in the wake of British colonialism in India, well, just more generally, did India live up to your expectations? Did you feel like it was as you'd imagined it, or?
I didn't really have any preconceived ideas, but like anybody else, I'd seen documentaries and travelogues and films about the natural life there and about city life. So I wasn't unaware of it, but certainly when I got there, we arrived initially in Mumbai and stayed. We did it all the right things. We stayed in the same hotel where George and Patty stayed, and indeed later John and Yoko in Mumbai, the Taj Mahal, right opposite the gateway, which was a fantastic place to be. But stepping out from there onto the streets of Mumbai, it was breathtaking, because it's nowhere like home.
Yes, certainly.
And it's actually after the trip was over that I, continuing my research, read a quote from Ringo, not too long ago, in which he said that though he had travelled to many countries by the time the Beatles went to India in initially 1966, they were all places recognisable to him in the way that the culture was lived and the people went about their daily lives. So talking of America and talking of Canada and talking of European countries and so on, Australia and New Zealand. But when he went to India, he knew he was far from home. He knew he was abroad. It was a foreign place. Because although the British imprint there is still pronounced in terms of its architecture and certain ways of life, like cricket being the national sport, for example, it really isn't anywhere like home. It does smell different. It sounds different. It's so crowded. Obviously, the poverty is quite breathtaking. But it is extraordinary. I felt safe there. I walked as much as I could. I took a lot of photographs. Went to local restaurants, didn't only do the touristy things, went into somebody's house, went into a couple of ashrams, tried to experience it as much as I could, and it really is foreign.
Certainly. Yeah, I remember going there, and for me the initial impression was very much the smell. I'd never smelled anything quite like that mix of just all matter of, everything you can imagine.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking it smells as old as it is, like cities like Varanasi are some of the oldest cities in the world, and it's a very old place. And this smell for me is always the first thing I think of when I think of going back to India. And you've recovered from your Delhi belly, which is very good. So
actually, I didn't get Delhi belly. I was so careful not to get Delhi belly, but I got something else instead. I just, without obviously knowing it, I picked up some kind of bacterial infection, which began to lay me low on about day 3 of the trip. We were there for 11 days. And because most days I was being filmed speaking, so if you want, I mean, the film, I don't know how it's going to be edited, but I've got the raw film of it on my computer. And if I watch it in chronological order, in sequence, I can see myself becoming more ill by the day. And my main bit to camera was really on the last day in Rishikesh, and I was in quite a poor state by then. So that's just one of the ironies of life. I've not been in a film before, and I know that this film, which will exist long after I do, will forever show me unwell. But hey, that's life.
It certainly is, yeah. Well, just to give me and others kind of a snapshot of what your life is like as a historian, as a researcher, as a writer. Just curious, what were you doing at the British Library today? What are you doing here?
Well, the British Library is something like a second home for me, because it is the national library of my home country. And it is, we have here, and we always have had here for centuries now, a system of what they call legal deposit, which means that if you publish a book or publish a newspaper or magazine or piece of music or whatever it might be, you have to deposit a copy in the National Library. The consequence of that over 2 or 3 centuries is that this place has a lot of material. And no matter how much one might know about any subject, there's always more to learn. So I come here in particular to look at back issues of newspapers, magazines, to look at books that are hard to find. And this afternoon, funnily enough, apropos our conversation, I was looking at an Indian newspaper on microfilm, because the Beatles had quite a few dalliances with India from 1966 onwards. And although you furnished me very kindly a few years ago with a great collection of Indian newspaper scans and photographs, there is more. And I need to see it all. And because of the trip that I've just taken to India, it's fresh for me. And although 1968 is, for me, volume 3, and I haven't yet published volume 2, you can't strictly delineate like that in terms of research, because it could be that in 68 they talked about something that goes back to 63, 4, 5, 6, back to their childhood, and that often happens, in fact. So I need to look at things for all the years, no matter what period I'm writing. So that's what I was doing. I was looking at microfilm of Indian newspapers, most of which are here. Astonishing collection of newspapers. Last time I was here, I was looking at the Hindustan Standard.
Yep.
Because it had an important piece that was published long after the Beatles had left Rishikesh, but which I knew about. So I wasn't just turning every page. I actually was looking specifically for something. But the reach of the British Empire, as was, is such that even after countries left the empire, they were still within the Commonwealth. And this place continues to gather their newspapers. Paul McCartney in 1966 paid a trip to Nairobi.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, a holiday to Kenya. And the Kenyan newspapers are here. Now, I don't know whether they're in any library in Kenya, but I don't need to go there and check because they're here. And you can order them up. And, there was good reportage of Paul's visit, which told me more about his trip to Kenya than I've ever read anywhere else, gave me the true detail of what he did and when he did it, and how he was approachable or not approachable during that trip. So that was, last time I came here, I found that. That is within the next book I'm writing. So the research it's hard to draw a line under it, because there is so much of it to be done.
Sure. I'd like to know more about your creative process. I read a lot. I love books about writing and writers on writing and all that. And many of my favorite writers, not all, but many of them, write every day. They really make it a point to write every single day. Do you subscribe to that philosophy? Do you make it a point to sit down at your desk every day and hammer out 500 or 1,000 words or whatever? Like, what is your philosophy when it comes to staying consistent with your work?
Are the writers you've just mentioned, are they principally fiction writers?
Yes.
Because to me, there's a huge difference, all the difference in the world between that discipline of ensuring that every day you stay in the zone by writing some quantity of words, and what I do, which is, as a historian, a lot of historians or biographers have somebody else do their research for them. I don't. I'm a one-man band. I do it all, the entire project.
That's amazing to me, really. You don't have a research assistant.
No. I when I have sufficient funds, I have people do some organizing of things for me, titling of things, cataloging, transferring, digital transfers, correction of images, that kind of thing. But otherwise, no, this book is 100% me, these books. And so because it's a history, I don't feel that it would be right for me to write anything until I've got my materials in the right order. So my method is quite straightforward. I research to the nth degree. Then I look at what I've got. I assemble a structure. And then I shut the door and I don't come out until it's done, which may take 3 or 4 years. But during the course of writing, you will find new things that need to be researched. You need to go and get a bit more on this. Is there anything on that I could possibly find? It's only when you tie up your disparate strands of research that a pattern or a picture really emerges. And then you can see where you're light, and you might need to go and do bits of further research. But for the most part, it's done. And I don't really see the wisdom of writing any part of that story until I've got the structure finalized, because I'll only have to undo it anyway. So I might as well gather it all together and then write. So the gathering process is what takes the lion's share of the time. The writing isn't exactly quick, but the research is years and years and years and years and years. And that's what I've been doing for years and years and years and years and years.
Right.
I started this entire project in 2003. It's now 2018. That's 15 years ago. The writing of Volume 1 took 3 years.
And that was after you'd gathered most of the research for that book.
Yes. Yeah. So you could say that in the 15 years I've been doing this, I've been doing 12 years nothing but research and 3 years of writing. Soon, the writing phase for Volume 2 will begin to balance that up a little bit more. But there's undoubtedly more research than writing time.
Right. Yeah.
You can spend 2-3 hours looking for one thing. To write about that, the information gained might be a line, but it's an important line. And I certainly don't want to write the book knowing that I could have found that line and didn't bother. So, it takes time.
Certainly. Listening to you speak, I'm thinking somewhat about my own experience writing master's theses, which is not nearly as big as what you've done, but it's an intense project.
Yeah.
And there's always the danger of that project taking over your life, where it becomes, you're kind of eating, living, breathing, sleeping this project. What does your family think of your work? And does your wife hate the Beatles at this point? I'm really very curious about that.
Well, I should really ask her that one. No, I think I can safely say what she does think on that one. Well, I've got 2 boys, 2 children, and they're both men now. They're both grown-up men who have flown the coop. One of them lives in Taiwan, and the other one lives in Finland. The eldest one is in Finland. The youngest one is in Taiwan. So, in terms of home life, it's just me and my wife. And all the time that she's known me, I've worked from home. So our domestic pattern is that we see each other pretty much any time. I'm not someone who goes off to an office somewhere and comes back late. So we have that familiarity of seeing each other all the time. Although mostly I'm squirreled away quietly in my office. But she'll be bringing me tea, and we have, confrontations during the day. That's probably the wrong word. We have not confrontations.
Freudian slip? Or?
Oh no Freudian slip. We have, we pass like ships in the night or the day, so that's all fine. And she doesn't hate the Beatles at all. She grew up as a Beatles fan, but on a different plane because she was living in South Africa and they didn't really have much knowledge of what was happening really over there.
That's interesting. I'd love to talk to her.
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at the South African newspapers here in the British Library, most of which are original papers, not even microfilm, so you can really turn the pages, because the Beatles were banned on South African broadcasting by the SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, in '66, after the so-called Bigger Than Jesus rumpus flared up in August 1966, and they weren't allowed back on the radio or television. Well, there was no television there till I think '77, so they didn't see them really, but they couldn't even hear them on the main SABC radio until 1971. So I was interested to see how the South African newspapers reflected the national broadcaster's point of view, because that is within the next book I'm writing. So that's proper, now research for me. But she's very tolerant of the fact that my job is a kind of all-consuming job. Obviously, we have a good marriage within it, but she recognizes that a job like this isn't really a 9-to-5 job. And it has, I do kind of allow it to monopolize most of my time. Right. And a job like this needs to. You can't just switch off, because you need to turn things over in your mind. And, I might go to bed and then suddenly get up and dictate something into my little digital recorder, a thought, a note that I want to capture before it disappears. So, it's when you immerse yourself so thoroughly in a subject, it is there constantly. But I'm perfectly happy about that. And the books are the better for it.
And I would imagine there's new information coming in just constantly. I mean, emails from people like me saying, hey, you're doing this project. Have you seen this? I imagine it never stops. And the other thing I wanted to know about too, after Tune In came out, the first book, did you get a wave of, hey, why didn't you write about this? Or I've got this, or have you seen this? Like, was there still, even after all that time and research, things that you had not missed, that's the wrong word, but things that you weren't aware of when you wrote the book?
Yeah, inevitably so. There's two parts to that question. The first part is, yes, I do receive a lot of, I say I write the books on my own or do them entirely on my own, and that's true, but there are a lot of very good people out there, kind people who have things and they are willing to share them with me. Either have you seen this that's just come up, a link to a website or a photograph or whatever it might be, or indeed it's something from their own collection. The thing about the Beatles is the paper trail is very rich and deep. And I am trying to find every piece of paper that's out there, because I want this to be a documented history. It's important that there is plenty of spoken voices in this book, and certainly like Tune In there will be. But I want to ensure accuracy by using documents as much as possible, and they really have been overlooked significantly by all other writers. To me, they are the absolute bedrock of what I'm doing. So a lot of people out there have collections of things that might include pieces of paper that contain information I haven't seen and don't know about. So there is actually an appeal in the back of the first book, Tune In, and there will be in the back of the second and the third, for people who have things that they think I might not know about to volunteer them. I don't need to see the original pieces. A scan will do, a photocopy, a snap with a phone. I just need to see the content of whatever that piece of paper says. I'm one of those guys who, when things come up for auction, big set of Beatles autographs, and it's autographs on the back of a script or a back of a letter or something like that, sod the autographs. I mean, I know what they look like. I want to know what's on the other side of that piece of paper. That's much more interesting for me. So I'm continually looking, and I do have a lot of emails every day of people who say, this might interest you, that might interest you, and I'm really grateful for all of those. And that takes up a considerable chunk. I typically start work about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm emailing till about 9, just to cope with the previous day's emails, which I tried not to answer when they came in because it would have been too much of a distraction. But it's all research time, really. And there's a lot of thanking people, a lot of asking people, a lot of chasing leads. I won't go into detail, but I'm presently talking to the sister of a man who worked for the Beatles, who died quite young, before he was ever interviewed. I just need to know more about this man. And in having finally made email contact with her, she says, I have some pieces of paper. I don't know what they are yet, but obviously in the next few days I'll be endeavouring to find out what they are. So this is how the day-to-day life goes on. As for the second part of the question, these books I'm writing are not designed to close down the subject. They're designed actually to open it up. Right. And no matter how many years you research something, you can't possibly know every place where there is something to find. So, and in a sense, it's the book itself that brings stuff out of the woodwork. So after Tune In was published, which in its fullest form is 1,700 pages, and takes the story up to the brink of the Beatles' great breakthrough. So it's just the formative period, and it's that big. You would think it has everything in it, but no, because when the book came out, I had all sorts of people contact me to say, I've got this, which I couldn't ever have known about or known where to look for it. But I accept that's, I'm piecing together people's lives, but you can't know where all the pieces are. So, for example, Ringo, who was never a great letter writer because English, having missed so much schooling, English was never his strong suit. Turns out that he met a girl at, I think, Butlin's holiday camp the first time that Rory Storm and the Hurricanes went there in 1960. And they obviously had some kind of a fling for a week or two, and then kept in touch. And wherever he was for the next couple of years, he wrote her letters, and she kept them all. And then shortly after Tune In came out, unrelated to its publication, she sold them. And I not only got photocopies of all the letters, but I got her phone number and I phoned her up and interviewed her. Got her story. Well, I would love to have included that in the book, but I simply didn't know about it. So I have that and much else ready to fold into an update at some point. But I'm not in any hurry to update them. I really want to get all 3 volumes of the trilogy out before I start to revise anything. But there will be scope for it because there is still more out there.
For sure, yeah, it's kind of endless. On that note, I mean, how many times a day do you get Beatles obsessives asking you, when's Volume 2 coming out?
Are they Beatles obsessives? They're people.
Perhaps they're just annoying people.
No, they're not. They're not annoying at all. There is one interesting element to it, which I'll come to in a moment. But no, I think I'm being asked that question a lot in the same way and by the same kind of people that I would be asking of another author. Look, I've started something, a trilogy, and in a sense I've left them dangling at the end of 1962 on New Year's Eve. I would want to know what's going to come next and when it's coming, more to the point. When can I read this book? So I do get quite a lot of that. The interesting thing is that it's 4.5 years since Tune In was published. Just of late, it's started to get a little bit more aggressive.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I've started to have people... It's always been a kind of pointed question. But just lately, there's been a kind of a I've noticed a degree of aggression creeping into the question as well. I know that whenever I'm seen to be doing anything that is not 100%, as far as they're concerned, working on the book, I get kind of slapped by a few people. What they don't know is that it's all book related, and even the trip to India, which is, this might seem to be this, why are you doing being in a film? Well, that film took me to India. It took me to Delhi. It took me into the shop where they went in '66. It took me to the hotel where they were staying. It took me into the room, in fact, where they stayed. It took me to look at Indian newspapers for that trip that they made, and so on. So it's all research for the books, really. But people are getting a bit tetchy now.
How dare you have a life, Mark?
Well, the amazing thing is I don't have much of a life beyond these books, and I'm perfectly happy about that. But and the people who are asking the question are asking for the best reasons of all. I mean, it's, you know, sure. I know the Oscar Wilde quote via Monty Python, but isn't it so that, you know, there's only one thing worse than being talked about, and that's not being talked about. So I'm, you know, if no one was asking where Volume 2 is, I'd think I hadn't done my job properly on Volume 1. It's a measure of the fact that that book was the strong object that it is, that people are wanting the next one. But though most of the people who are asking have no real notion of the work that goes into a book like this. And they didn't really see Volume 1 coming. It was reported that I was writing it, but essentially until people read it, they didn't realise what I was doing. And that had taken 10 years. So, and I'm, you know, although I had done quite a bit of the research of Volume 2, there's significant amounts I've done in the last 4 years since Tune In came out. So I'm, you know, I'm not dragging my heels in any way. In my own self-interest, I need to finish it. I'm not getting any younger. But these things can't be done quickly. The nature of them is that they are thorough and time-consuming. It's my time they're consuming, nobody else's. And when eventually these books are published, then they will be out there. And the fact that along the way they took a year longer than somebody thought they should have done will be irrelevant.
Going back to when Volume 1 came out, you invest all of this time, effort into this massive project. I'd really like to know, how did you feel on the eve of the book's publication when it was about to come out? Like, what were you thinking? Were you nervous at all? Were you relieved that it was just about that book, that project was over? Like, how did you feel?
Because it's a trilogy, it was just like doing the first lap of a race, really. So I mean, the only time I'll breast the finishing tape is at the end of Volume 3, or maybe Volume 4, because this trilogy might end up having 4 parts. Oh wow! If I still have my health, 10 or 12 or whatever, however many number of years it is from now. So no, I just remember being. There was the writing process is on a book like this. First of all, it's all the years of research, then it's all the years of writing, and then you nurse it through production. And I'm not a hands-off author. My publishers always thankfully accept the fact that the best way of keeping me happy is to let me be part of all the processes, which I am, and I'm good at all that kind of stuff. And I had a great team at the publishers to help it into fruition as well. So eventually there was such a build-up to it in terms of proofs, and then you go into the publicity stage, and some of the publicity these days is quite long in advance. So it just kind of was all seamless, really. And eventually it came out, and there was a great launch for it in Liverpool, which was the right place to launch that book. A tremendous launch party. I mean, not only the best I've been to, but most of the people, if not all the people there, said it was, you know, one for their memories as well. And then some months of promotion, but I was already very much focused on Volume 2. I mean, I remember doing some of the interviews for the promotion of Volume 1 here at the library when I was already, head down on Volume 2, because there's no time really for holidays or breaks. Otherwise, the books will take even longer than they are. So it was great to have it out. I knew that I've heard recording artists say that when they've made a good album, they know it. And I knew I'd written a good book. I knew that what I said at the outset of the entire project, which was that I felt that the Beatles story had never been told properly, and I was going to have a go at doing just that. And I knew that I had accomplished that with the first volume. Thankfully, the reviews and the public acclamation for it bore that out, but I knew already that I had done what I set out to achieve. But I've now got that challenge again for Volume 2, which is actually, if anything, a harder task than the first book. Much harder, really. And it's still in front of me. And I'm quite a bit older than I was when I was doing Tune In. I think I'm still peaking, but I'll find out when the real hard challenge comes into place, because organising this set of material for Volume 2, which covers the years 63 to 66, is incredibly difficult. It's so much more complicated and complex a story than Volume 1 was, which was detailed but relatively straightforward, quite linear. And this one is not linear. So how to keep the reader engaged, how to keep the forward propulsion, and how to report the detail that needs reporting within an engaging read is, I know I can do it, but I know it's going to be harder than it was for Tune In, and that was tricky.
You seem to be driven by an incredible sense of duty, and I remember that really becoming quite apparent the first time we spoke back, I guess, in 2016. I hope this question isn't redundant, but do you have moments or periods of frustration or Beatle fatigue, shall we say? Like, do you hit that wall where it's like, I just need to get away from this for a while? I need to, I don't want to hear any rock music. Do you have those moments? How do you stay fresh? How do you stay sort of recharged, just on a personal level?
Yeah, it's a good question. One would imagine that I do suffer moments of Beatle fatigue. I like that phrase. And that I need to recharge and get right away from it. But the actual reality is I don't. I don't suffer the fatigue, and I don't need to get away from it. It's just the way I'm cut. It's just my DNA is that this is something I can do, and this is something I'm highly motivated to do, highly self-motivated. I mean, no one has to drag me out of bed at 6 o'clock to go to my desk. I'm there. And if I'm really busy, it'll be before 6. And some people have heard me say this before, but I try to do a double day every day. My eldest son says I do a 5 to 9 working day, meaning 16 hours, not 4. I just have that motivation. I do have, you called it really when you said a sense of duty. I hadn't actually considered that before, but it is exactly that. This is, the Beatles story is the best story ever. And I'd say that not as a fan or anything as juvenile or as simplistic as that. I mean quite simply that in terms of storytelling, the Beatles have the greatest story. And you don't need to embellish it in any way. You just need to tell it truthfully. And it is breathtaking, riveting, surprising, delightful, incredibly funny, at times incredibly sad, poignant, interesting, innovative. And I am not happy with the biographies of the Beatles. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I've already had one of the authors, a biographer, pull me apart in public for what he thought was me being overly critical and ungrateful of things. But I think Tune In showed it. Tune In, which had in its fullest form, 1,700 pages up to their breakthrough, and it doesn't drag for a minute. It's not boring, because these are, as I often say, interesting people doing interesting things all the time. And it's embedded in our culture, and not just this culture in my home country, which was the Beatles' home country, but most countries. They are resonating somehow or other more or as much 50 years on as they did at the time. Not more, but certainly strongly, and differently. So I don't want to go to my grave knowing I could have got this story right for posterity, for future study, for future appreciation and enjoyment, for future criticism, if you like. I'm not trying to say the Beatles were great. I'm just putting the story down on paper. If I die without doing that, no one else is going to do it, and at least not like this. And so there is a duty there. There's a duty to this thing that has been enriching my own personal life for 55 years now, and of which I can never tire. So, duty, yes, absolutely a duty to the Beatles, who don't always treat me as well as they could, personally. But that doesn't matter. That really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how they treat me, good or bad. It's just about getting the story right, even despite them sometimes.
I have a perfect follow-up question. Just give me 1 second. Okay, we're good. Are you aware of the Paul McCartney song Early Days?
Paul McCartney's song Early Days, yes, it was on his last studio album called New that came out, I think, the week that Tune In came out, by coincidence, in 2013. Yes, I know it.
How do you read that song? Did you interpret that as a bit of a, I suppose, a dig at you? Just because the lyric is to refresh everyone's memory, what is it? You know, the basic gist is kind of you weren't there. You last time we spoke, you imitated George Harrison saying to you, "You weren't the."
You weren't the. And George did say that to me, to my face. And George was quite critical of me over a number of years. But it wasn't me personally he was digging at. It was what I represent, which is, so-called experts who think they know my life and they don't know it, which is an absolutely understandable position to take. When Tune In came out, a chap got in touch with me and said, could he write my biography? The biography of a biographer. And not only did I say, I'd rather you didn't, or at least not yet, or whatever, but I remember thinking, how the hell is he going to understand me and get my life story right?
That must have been quite the just a kind of a surreal experience for you.
It was odd, but I do get quite an interesting mailbag. I was flattered, obviously. Who wouldn't be? But I knew that it's premature, or indeed should never be done. But certainly this person wasn't going to be the right person. So, and no disrespect, because I don't even know him, but I could just tell by the approach that it wasn't right. So I understood always where George was coming from. Didn't necessarily welcome him saying it to my face, but that is who I'm dealing with here. So Paul McCartney, Early Days, yes, he writes. The song is about, essentially it's the same theme. You weren't there, so how do you know? It was only me and my friends. Is the gist of that one. He wasn't having a dig at me only. Yeah. I think I'm part of a mix in his head. I'm quite an astute watcher of Paul McCartney, more so than most people, I would say, because not only have I been watching him for a very long time, but also I think I look differently. And I worked for him for a long time and got to know the man and got to see the things that riled him and got to see how he dealt with things that riled him. And I remember it was when he first started doing Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite on tour. Now, I don't follow it closely enough anymore to know what tour that was, 2011 or 12 maybe, in that period. And a whole load of people jumped up and said, "You can't do that. It's a John Lennon song." First of all, no one, as he would rightly consider, no one can tell me what songs I can do and what songs I can't do. And even if it is a John Lennon song, does that mean he can't do it? Some people have a dividing line in their heads that isn't necessarily there in his. So he was pissed off with that. But also he was particularly pissed off because he remembered being at John's house in Weybridge in 1967 when John was writing Mr. Kite and helping him with it. He was not only present watching him, but he was engaged in the process. Because the way they did things, a lot of people misunderstand the Lennon and McCartney songwriting methodology, which varied through the years. But at this point in time, one of them would have the idea, and often the first verse and maybe as far as the chorus. And then you look to your partner, where does it go from here? So you've set the theme in both in lyrically and musically, but you're still reaching out to the other, McCartney to Lennon or Lennon to McCartney for, to get over the finishing line. And that was Mr. Kite. So Paul bristled because he had, as far as he was concerned, he had been involved in the writing of that song. It wasn't just a John Lennon song as the history books have it. So that annoyed him, and I watched him being annoyed by it in an interview or two and read a quote or two, and I thought, a raw nerve has been touched here. And I think that song is the result of lots of people telling him, this was how it was, when he knows that it wasn't. But the fact that it came out the same week as my book was a delicious coincidence. But I wouldn't flatter myself that it was just about me. He and I worked for him for a long time, and he and I always got on great. He respected me to whatever degree, I'm not sure, but there was a respect there. Look, he employed me because he knew I could deliver. So... and then probably stopped employing me for some other reason. But no, it's hard when other people, we can't put ourselves exactly in their position of other people telling them what it was they did in their life when they didn't do it, or vice versa.
Sure, yeah. Just to go full Beatle nerd here for a minute, which I suppose we've already well past that point. I often wonder, I don't know if you have any insight into this at all, but I often wonder, because John has been sort of lionized and sainted in a way since his death. I mean, to many people, he's sort of the icon of peace and love, and he can do no wrong, when in reality, he was a deeply flawed, complicated man, like all of us, I guess. I wonder the extent to which that annoys Paul. I wonder, obviously I'm sure he's misses his friend and all the rest. Of course, deeply traumatic experience for him to lose his friend. But in the years since, it seems that many people put John way above Paul in the category of, who was more important to the band. I wonder how much that digs at him. Do you have any sense of that?
First of all, I think that the years of John Lennon being lionized, and I'll touch on this in the second part of the answer, but the years in which John Lennon was lionized are behind us now. I think actually there's a lot of misinterpretation and misunderstanding of John Lennon, and I'm beginning to find that people out there in 2018 who judge things by today's standards, who judge yesterday by today, and we do an awful lot of that.
Yes, we do.
Far too much of it, really. The morals of yesterday, the standards of yesterday, the things that were perfectly permissible yesterday that are no longer so today are judged retrospectively. And John Lennon is beginning, I think, to fall into that category where people are disliking him for things he did.
It's very interesting. I wonder if that is a English thing, because I don't have a sense of that, but I wonder if it's different over here or something.
We're a pretty critical lot in England, and that's part of our DNA, and it's part of the Beatles' own DNA because they're British. So, but generally, and because John has now been gone for 37 and a half years, we have more than one generation who did not know the man. In fact, let's say that if you didn't know him, if you were 10 years old when he was killed, and you're now nearly 50, you barely know the guy. I mean, he wasn't even in Britain in those last 9 years of his life. So I think John Lennon is becoming less understood, and with that is becoming a kind of an intolerance with certain aspects of his personality which may appear from the distance of time to be less savoury than they appeared at the time. For example, on stage, and you can look at this in lots of film, John used to do this act, this kind of cripple act, of clapping his hands but missing them, and stamping his feet like stamping his feet like an able-bodied person, except in a kind of spasmodic, erratic way. At the time, that was not an issue at all for anybody. He did it on the Beatles' first huge British TV appearance, Sunday night at the London Palladium, our Ed Sullivan show, if you like. No one said a word about it. It wasn't mentioned in the newspapers. It wasn't mentioned on the radio or television. There were no, as far as I can see, no letters written about it. No one complained. No one went off the Beatles. It didn't in any way affect their rise. Now it would be death to do that.
Oh, without question.
And so clips of film in which he's doing that, they look a bit odd now in 50 years on in 2018, or indeed any time in the last 25 years, but they didn't look odd then. And you can't really judge then by now's standards, at least not accurately, because he didn't mean to be offensive, which is why no one took offense. And indeed, he wasn't the only one doing that kind of thing. Anyway, long answer. Paul McCartney, I think Paul has come to terms now with where John is at, nearly 40 years after his assassination. But there's no question that it affected Paul quite a lot in the first 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years maybe after John was killed. Until the early 90s, there were quite a lot of obvious signs of his irritation, publicly visible irritation at John's lionization. It was visible that night when he came out of the recording studio and gave his first piece to camera, his first reaction to John's death, when he said it's a drag, whilst casually chewing on gum, which upset quite a lot of people. But I'm a McCartney watcher. I could see that he was irritated. He was irritated by what he'd been watching on television in the recording studio, the news bulletins. The lionization had begun. The promotion of John Lennon, which is inevitable in death whenever anybody dies, to the detriment of, while one goes up, another goes down. It's the balance of life. So John was being promoted, Paul was being relegated, and he didn't like it.
And that footage, too, you see irritation. When I see that as a man who doesn't know Paul, I see shock. I mean, he looks like he's just seen someone get hit by a car or something. Like, he looks absolutely shocked.
He is shocked. He had lost someone that he loved. And, we all know what that feels like. But he was also exhibiting irritation, and it came out in this way that made him appear to be flip. Yeah. When we lose loved ones, we don't have cameras thrust in our faces. Yeah. But like I said, if you're a McCartney watcher, you get to see beyond the surface. And I could see that he was irritated, and that irritation lasted for years. Through the Ray Coleman books, through the Albert Goldman books, certainly through Philip Norman's Shout, which he detested.
Really?
He absolutely detested that book, and for quite rightly so, because Philip Norman quite ridiculously detested Paul McCartney in the writing of it, which was insane. To actually make Paul McCartney out to be this ludicrous lightweight, which was so stupid. Paul called that book shite, and called him Norma Phillips. And I had helped Philip write the book, and I was embarrassed with that attitude, but I still liked the book. I still thought it was a good book. and I liked Philip as a person then. But Paul didn't. And you could see why. If you read that book, you can understand why Paul was mightily annoyed by it. And that really extended for the whole of the 80s. And eventually it calmed down. And I think he's well over it now.
Let me ask you a question about interviewing people.
Yeah.
as I sit here and interview you.
Yeah.
So just as an example, I prepared for this interview today, sitting with you face to face, differently than I would prepare for my interview with you when we were on Skype. Obviously, face to face is, I think, for my money, it's just always so much better. You can go different places in the conversation. You can actually see the person there. You can respond to their energy. You can, Skype is a lot different. Yeah. And as one who interviews a lot of people for this book, do you have any kind of advice or best practices for approaching interviews? Or is everyone just very, very different? Do you prepare for each interview very different? Or do you just simply get people to sort of, ask open-ended questions and get them to sort of open up and share their story? What's your take on that?
I prefer to interview face-to-face every time. Skype is a good second. It's a new thing that hasn't been there for very long in the lives of writers, but we now have this opportunity to see people who are far away, and that is better than a phone call, which is the third way. Email interviews I don't like, because there's a formalization to the typing of an answer, and you don't have the opportunity to shape it in the way that you can in dialogue, in spoken word. So I very much try to avoid email interviews. Phone interviews, yes. Skype, quite a lot of these, because people, I live in England and I go to America to interview people from time to time, but sometimes you've just got to jump in and do what you can when you can. But where possible, face-to-face produces best results because of the technique I use, which is to dress the area in which we're meeting with materials that will help propel the person back into the right time zone. So if I'm talking, let's say I'm talking to a woman in her 70s who was a teenager in the Cavern seeing the Beatles at lunchtime, Monday, Wednesday and Friday, I will have Liverpool Echo newspapers, pictures of the Beatles in the Cavern, some issues of Mersey Beat, some tickets, some fan club cards, pictures of the houses, pictures of the Cavern, and it never fails to produce good results because it takes people right back to the moment, and it unlocks memories. Without fail, I would say, and it sounds self-aggrandizing, but without fail, every time I interview someone, whoever it might be, they at the end of it, the person will say, God, I've thought about things that I haven't thought about for years, because of this unlocking process. They will look at a picture and go, oh, that's my friend. Oh, that's the coat that she bought in Lewis's. Oh, I was with her that day. In fact, we bumped into Paul that day when we were in the shop. Well, I would never have thought to ask, did you ever see Paul while you were out shopping? And she may not have thought to mention it. But because we've seen the picture, connection, and out it comes. This story is unlocked that the person themselves may not have thought about for a very long time.
How and why did you start doing that? Did someone else give you that idea, or did you just kind of come to that on your own?
Well, my wife is a psychotherapist, and since meeting her, I've been more familiarized with certain unlocking processes. Actually, I think I came up with that on my own. But when I told her about it, she said, oh, yes, this is a process that can be used. It's psychotherapy. So it was in the mix of probably my marital relationship that these ideas took shape. But it undoubtedly helps. I mean, it helps massively. And I would recommend it to anybody interviewing anyone about any subject. Sometimes I'll play music or we'll watch a video of something just before we start. And if it's by Skype, if it's a remote interview, I'll send them things as JPEGs or PDFs or video files to, have a look at this before we speak. I also have an outstanding collection. It sounds immodest, but I must have, because it's my job, I must have the world's greatest collection of Beatles documentation. And I can invariably find something that is associated with the person I'm talking to. And it might be something they haven't seen for years, a letter they wrote or a letter they received or a picture with them in it or a bit of film that they're in and they may not have realized it. So I will always share everything I've got with that person, which again helps send them back into the zone and produces a better quality interview. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I'm going to steal that.
Please, yeah.
That's great.
I mean, I think whatever discipline you're doing, whether you're making a film or a TV program, radio, that enriching process is always going to bring results.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. Take me back. The first time I interviewed you a couple of years ago, you said something that I didn't follow up on, and I wish I had. You were talking about getting your start as a writer in the late 70s, and you said, I believe exactly, you said, I had things to say about the Beatles that I wanted to say that weren't being said. What were those things?
I was born to research. I knew instinctively how to do it, how to look things up, where to find what I was looking for, and my first research commission was actually from Philip Norman when he was writing what turned out to be Shout. I don't think it had that title. And without his propelling me, I probably would have got there anyway, because I was always, a Beatles guy and I was always a researcher. But he set me some challenges. He wanted me to find out the backstory of how the Beatles began broadcasting on the BBC. He wanted me to find out the date that Lennon met McCartney, because he sensed, I think, that in the existing books it wasn't right. And he wanted me to find out about a tour of Scotland that the Beatles did with a singer called Johnny Gentle. So I went and became his researcher, and part-time, as it were, and found out these things for him and then carried on. I satisfied his queries. He didn't need any more information, but I had the bug and I carried on. And my inquiries into the Johnny Gentle tour, the process of doing that, eventually led me to researching all of the Beatles' live appearances. Every time they'd stepped on a stage in front of an audience, from when John Lennon formed his skiffle group until Candlestick Park in San Francisco in 1966. And that became my first book. Well, when you do research like that, what are you going to do with it? Philip Norman didn't want it, and his book Shout was out by then. I mean, I was still doing it. So the obvious thing was to write it up myself. So I started to write it, and I hadn't done any writing courses, and I wasn't a brilliant writer to begin with by any means, but just through application, I learned how to construct sentences. I learned how to express myself. I learned in particular how to convey detail in a way that engages the reader. And then I just carried on, and eventually I found I can write. In fact, I think I'm a good writer. And I think, a lot of people do say the same. I'm flattered when they do, but yourself, I think by the same measure by which we have to know when something we're doing is crap, by the same measure we have to know if something we're doing is good. And I know when things are crap, and I know when they're good. And I know now that I'm a confident writer.
When you were a kid then, was the dream, if we can call it a dream, did you see yourself as just a researcher or as a historian? Or
No, I didn't have dreams like that. I had a regular job to begin with. I worked at the BBC in clerical positions, although even there I was in the right place, because the BBC, particularly in those days, before it started lacerating itself to pieces, which it is doing these days, had in-house, for the benefit of its staff, fantastic library resources. So I was researching the Beatles as a 16, 17, 18-year-old in my lunchtimes for no particular purpose, other than the fact that I was interested in whatever it was I could find. So, but I had no particular idea to become a writer. And initially I was a researcher for other authors. So I helped Philip Norman with a couple of his books. I did his Beatles book and his Elton John book. I also was Ray Coleman's researcher on his Lennon books, his Brian Epstein book, and his Eric Clapton book. And during the course of those years, started to become an author in my own right. In fact, it was Philip Norman was starting his John Lennon book. Must have been about 2003. Wanted me to be his researcher to, reunite that team, if you like, of me doing research and him doing the writing. And it was in that very moment when I was deciding to do this trilogy. And I had the dilemma, which I remember sharing with my literary agent. What do I do if I find a piece of, really great detail? I'll want to keep it for my book and I won't want to share it, but I'll have been paid, so morally I ought to share it. I didn't want to be having those moral dilemmas in my head. And my agent said, hey, you're a writer yourself now. You're not anybody else's researcher. So, just do yours. So I said no to Philip and embarked on this project.
Well, there you have it. There's part one of my conversation with Mark Lewisohn. I hope you enjoyed it. And just a quick note before I let you go. Well, actually, two quick notes. The first note is, if you enjoyed this show and you want me to continue making new episodes, please be sure you subscribe and leave a rating and review on iTunes. That's enormously helpful to me. And secondly, again, if you want to listen to the second half of this conversation, you can go on iTunes or whatever podcast provider you're using, and you can find part B of episode 1 of my conversation with Mark Lewisohn, where we get into more about the Beatles, more about Mark's work habits, and he also shared some really interesting tips on writing, which I found particularly valuable. So in particular, any writers or creative people out there, I really think you're not going to want to miss part B of episode 1 with Mark Lewisohn. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to pick up Mark's book. I really can't recommend it enough. It's called Tune In, and it is probably one of the best music books ever written. I'm not kidding. It's that good. It's that absorbing. It's that well-researched and well-written. Be sure you pick up a copy of Mark's book called Tune In. You can find that on Amazon and booksellers all over the place. Otherwise, thank you again for listening. Your support means a great deal to me. Until next time, remember that life is short, so be sure to enjoy every moment. Go out and have yourself a good weekend, day, afternoon. Whatever you're doing, I hope you have a great time. And I'll talk to you again very, very soon. Hello and welcome, fellow human. My name is Zachary Stockhill, and you are listening to Humans in Love, a podcast that looks at culture, relationships, and personal development from unconventional perspectives. Join me as I dig into the question of how people like you and I might get more out of life and love. Thanks for being here. Hello again, fellow human. Today I'm bringing you part 2 of my conversation with Beatles historian and the world's leading authority in the Beatles, Mr. Mark Lewisohn. In today's conversation, we go deeper into some of the issues we covered in part 1, but we also get more into Mark's work habits, how he actually gets work done. We get more into some serious Beatles nerdery. We talk a lot about Liverpool and his experience of that city, and a little bit about my experience of that city. Basically, if you're interested in the Beatles, and also if you just want to learn from someone at the very top of their creative field, I think you're not going to want to miss this conversation today. A quick note before we get started that, as always, subscriptions, ratings, and reviews are absolutely critical for a show's success, especially in these early days. So if you're enjoying this show, if you want me to continue making new episodes, please be sure you subscribe on iTunes and leave a rating and review. Without any further ado, here's part 2 of my conversation with the world's leading authority on the Beatles, Mr. Mark Lewisohn. I'll start there. Could you talk a little bit about your views on interviewing or not interviewing the living Beatles for this project, and where, what are you thinking as far as that goes?
I would be up for interviewing both Paul and Ringo, given the opportunity. The opportunity is not available to me right now. But at the moment of me saying this, Paul McCartney is 75, soon to be 76, and Ringo is soon to be 78. And, they're not 25, 26, 28, or 35, 36, 38. They're well into their 70s. They're closer to their 80s, and they've had very full lives. And I think the value of what they can give in interviews is diminishing. And I say that not in any way to insult them, because it's just nature and life, the cycle of life, that affects each and every one of us, whether we're famous or not. So it would be good to ask them certain specific things. But just about 2 weeks ago, from the point of me saying this, I emailed a couple of questions to Paul, specific. I won't go into the detail, but asking him to say a word or two on the record about a couple of people that they met along the journey. And they would be people that he remembers, I'm sure, important people in their time. And he was gracious enough to reply, which was gratifying in a sense. But he didn't want to engage with it. And I think one of the reasons could be, and I'm only guessing here, but it could well be that he really doesn't remember them very well anymore. It's a long, long time ago. So the value of interviewing people of age is naturally a diminishing one. I spend a lot of my time still trying to find people who were first-hand witnesses to events. And the quality of the interviews that I'm able to get from them when I do find them is noticeably less now than it was when I began this project 15 years ago. There's a big difference between interviewing people who are in their 60s and interviewing people who are in their 80s. Yes, they might remember knowing someone or being somewhere with someone, but when you actually, as a writer, that's of no particular benefit to me. Yes, I remember them. Well, okay, I'm writing a book about them. But in terms of what occurred at this moment, this episode, what do you remember of that incident? It's gone. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but the key point to remember is that the people that I'm writing about may well be among the planet Earth's most interviewed people ever. And although a lot of those interviews, from my point of view, have left something to be desired, because the questions they are asked are not the kind that bring illuminating answers. At the same time, they have been interviewed so many times well, in periods of their lives when the moments they're describing were much closer than we are now, and therefore fresher. I can use all of that. And I am using all of that. I mean, I have vast amounts of first-hand Beatle reminiscences to use, very few of which were ever heard by anybody at all. But even if they were, it would be so long ago they don't remember. And now they can be used in context. And I will, of course, always attribute where every quote comes from, which I think is part of the transparency of this. So it's regretful that I can't get to ask Paul and Ringo all the things I would like to ask them, but I'm not so sure how valuable it would be. I honestly could say that what I would value most from Paul and Ringo would be them allowing me access to pieces of paper that they've kept. and then maybe we could talk about them together. That would be of great use to me. That would, be, I think, in engaging and fun for them as well as for me, but it would also educate me. And that's what I'm after. But at the present time, I haven't got that access either.
Of all the living Beatles, I guess we can kind of. George is not living anymore, but you knew him. You had occasion to meet him personally before he passed away.
He's living somewhere.
Let's hope. We miss George.
Well, he believed he would be, and I go with that.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I'll go along with that too, for sure. I was interviewing Sylvie Simmons. I'm not sure if you know her. She's an English rock writer. She wrote a masterful biography of Leonard Cohen called I'm Your Man, which is another of my favorite music biographies. I was interviewing her, and I was asking her about the extent to which she's able to a certain extent, detach emotionally from her subject. So she came to this project as a massive Leonard Cohen fan. Leonard Cohen had a massive impact on her life. And I'm always interested to talk to people like you, as a massive fan of the Beatles, one who grew up with them from an early age, who has, I would imagine, a lot of, to some extent, some emotional attachment to them. How are you able to detach, to a certain extent, from what you're writing about? As part of that question, I'm also very interested to know what it was like for you as a younger man meeting the Beatles for the first time, like meeting some of your idols for the first time. What was that experience like?
Well, to answer the first part, detachment is not difficult for me at all. It just is a matter of, I think, the author's personality. I have been passionate about the Beatles all my life. And a big part of that passion is the discovery of knowledge. And that's really where I'm at now. I use the passion to maintain my energy on the project, because by the time I'm finished, it's going to be 30 years or thereabouts since I began, and it is almost entirely all I do. I mean, it's 99.99% of my life. For 30 years, on top of many prior years of research and engagement in projects. So I use the passion to maintain my energy levels and to ensure that I don't flag. But I'm not in any way seeking to just write a hagiography and, weren't they wonderful? And here's why. I've said this before, but it really comes down to the fact that, in my view, the Beatles stood for truth, and that they can best be served by a piece of biography, a piece of work like this that is utterly truthful in every line, in every sentence, in every paragraph and chapter, every page. So it's honoring them by getting their story as accurate as possible and truthful as possible. And that includes the bits that aren't so nice and aren't so wonderful and will make people think, I didn't know that about them. Oh, dear. Because we all have those in our locker. And but the point is, Albert Goldman made a speciality of researching his subjects thoroughly and deeply and well, and then writing about one side of them only. Whereas I'm looking for balance, I'm looking for the complete picture. And there's no doubt that this is a happy and uplifting story, but populated by people who led extraordinary lives, including some moments that, we all have. But nothing's going to be left out if it's germane to the telling of the story. So I am able to detach entirely from the passion and my interest in it to simply being that of a narrator, of a historian who's gone out there, found every piece of information on detail and color that can be found, and puts it down to see the story that it tells.
But at the same
I'm
time,
not leaving anything.
If I can interject momentarily, at the same time, as an outsider looking in, it seems very clear to me, and I find it inspiring, that it seems that your passion hasn't waned for this subject since you began this project all those years ago. It's impressive.
Well, thank you. It hasn't waned at all. In fact, with everything I learn, the layers of appreciation just accrue, and that's gratifying for me because I've never reached the point of going, oh, really, how uninteresting, how boring, of me gaining a kind of sarcastic relationship with the subject I'm writing about. I don't need that. I mean, I'm just a realist. It's just we all have a set of skills in our lives, and my set of skills, it just so happens, are suited to doing exactly what this project requires, and that includes a sense of detachment and a desire simply to write the truth, no matter what that truth is. Because overall, the story is going to be the story of the people who changed our culture, and that's got to be a good thing.
Tell me about meeting some of the members of the band for the first time. I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Well, I never met John Lennon. I didn't meet. I've met Ringo so briefly that I can barely remember it, let alone him. I met George on a handful of occasions, which were very much mixed in terms of their enjoyment level for me, from the very good to the really shitty. And I met Paul on many occasions because I had a working relationship with him. He hired me for many years to do work for him, which I think is one of the things that spoiled my relationship with George, to be honest. It seemed quite clear to me at the time that the two were linked. But George took against me for reasons that were wholly unfair and actually in every sense wrong, but he believed it. He had his truth. I respect the right for everybody to hold their truths. However, in his case, it was ludicrously unfair, and I had no right of reply. And that is being maintained against me to this day, it seems, from what I can gather, by his widow, Olivia, who, I don't know, she doesn't know me at all, but because George had a problem with me, I think she's maintaining that on his behalf, perhaps. A half hour over a cup of coffee would change a lot of things, but I haven't had that opportunity. Paul was good from the start with me. We got on well. There was mutual respect, which is why he wanted to hire me. And I was privileged to go to a number of parties and recording sessions and video shoots and all of that, not because I was a friend, but because I was hired. But he didn't mind my company, that's the point. And it was good. It was good. But even that came to an end, as most things do. So I haven't actually seen Paul for quite a while now.
What was it like meeting some of these people who, I imagine you kind of, were icons to you for a long time?
Yeah, well, I apart from this sentence in which I'm about to use it, and here it comes now, I never use the word icon. Iconic, it's all so massively overplayed that I have this thing that you will never see those words in my books. And I tell the people who are working on my books that we can't use icon, we can't use legend, and quite a few other modern buzzwords. I needed to get that off my chest, excuse me.
No, not at all.
But to me, the first time I met Paul was very special. It was I'd been to concerts and things, but the first time we actually shook hands and all of that was 1986. And my first book had just come out and he really liked it. So he wanted to tell me how much he liked it. So it was an easy conversation to have. I've never been in the position of having to impress them, as it were. When you've got 20 seconds and you want to say something truly tremendous that they don't forget. They're actually used to that. That's kind of part of the daily life for them and has been for half a century. I was fine. I was cool. I've always been a professional in if I'm there as a professional, I behave professionally. I'm a little lighter in tone than I used to be. I used to be more serious as a person than I am now. But they were fine with me and kept me employed for many years. because I was obviously giving them what it was they were looking for in terms of delivery of work. And with George, I thoroughly enjoyed meeting George. It was a potentially fraught situation because he was uncertain about meeting someone who was deemed to be a Beatles expert because his own character and personality was, well, who are these? I've never even met this guy. How can he be an expert on my life? Which I completely understand. But when we did meet, it was good. And the first time I met George, I was there to interview him. It was at a film studios in the Handmade Films period. And he was running late from the previous interview. He was doing an afternoon of interviews, and I was like, the penultimate one in the list, I think. And but as ever with these, with rock stars, you can find yourself waiting 3 hours, after the appointed time. But he was great. He came out and said, look, I don't have time to do this now. Everything's been overrunning, but we could go for a drink if you like. And so me and another guy, also named Mark Ellen, we jumped in George's car and he drove us around to the bar on the film set, on the film studio lot. And then we went for a couple of beers, which was great. I mean, it was just great to be sitting at a table having a couple of beers with George. We got on really well. It was just natural. So when I actually did the interview with him a few days later, it was like we knew each other. And he was nice to me from that point on until I really started working for Paul. And then he kind of just took against me. And the last time I saw him, he was really quite unpleasant. But that doesn't affect me in any way whatsoever with what I think of George and the way I'm going to write about him. The two are entirely separate things.
Not to drag this on, and feel free to pass on this question, but do you have any sense of why George, why your relationship with him soured? Do you think it's simply because he felt that you were prioritizing Paul's interests over his?
Well, his relationship with Paul post-Beatles was no one really knows it except for the two of them, but it was a strained one, let's put it that way. And I shall be, if I end up writing what I hope will be the fourth volume in this trilogy, then I will explore some of that, because George's relationship with Paul, which predated his relationship with John, in as much as Paul introduced him to John, was definitely a strained one right through until George's death, which is, a big chunk of time. And I think I just got caught up in the eddy of that in some minor way. I know that during the anthology, there is reported to be, and I haven't seen it, some film from the anthology where the cameras were running and Paul and George were discussing me, and Paul was saying that I was a wanker, and George was saying I was a wanker, and Paul was saying, no, Mark's all right. And in the end, Paul got his way because I was employed on that project. But it was against George's wishes to a degree. There were some trade-offs on the anthology, whereas, Paul could bring in so-and-so and George could bring in so-and-so and Ringo could bring in so-and-so, and I was one of Paul's. And indeed it went through, and it was a happy project. But George had a thing about experts. One of the unpleasant times I was with George was, this sounds like I'm name dropping and I don't mean it to, but it was at George Martin's house in 1992. We were filming the Making of Sgt. Pepper TV documentary, and I was consultant researcher on that, whatever. And George Harrison assented to do an interview for it and came over to, I was hoping we'd do it at Friar Park, but he said he'd come over to George Martin's house, which was great. He came over in his Porsche and we hung out in George Martin's house for a while, which was a very nice thing to do, except that he was unpleasant to me the whole time, George. And he tested me. He said, if you're an expert, he pointed to a picture in a book and said, who's that man? An Indian guy who was at a Beatles session. And funnily enough, I'd been at a Beatles convention in LA a couple of years earlier, and someone had come up to me and said, the man in that photograph, who you don't know his name, His name is, and he wrote it down on a bit of paper, and I stuck it inside the book. And so when George said to me, "If you're such an expert, what's that man's name?" I was thinking, oh God, I was trying to visualize that piece of paper, but I couldn't. I couldn't remember the guy's name, and it was a guy called Omir Dasgupta, who I now know quite a lot about because he's an interesting fellow, and he was at the sessions and indeed lived at George and Patty's bungalow for a couple of months, I think, in that period of time. And I think played on Within You, Without You as well. So that was the answer. But, not a very cool thing of George to put me on the spot like that and kind of make that the acid test of whether I was an expert or wasn't. But, he was playing with me. And, the thing about famous people is they always think they've got the power in any relationship. And because we other mere mortals kind of give it to them. And if I was with him now, I'd think I'd just tell him off.
Yeah.
Because why not? But those things happen.
Sure. And I mean, going back to your point you made about not using language like legends and icon, and I completely agree that they're very, very overused. And I think the danger is when you use those words too much, particularly if you were, doing a project like yours and still using those words, you forget that there's a human underneath all of that. All of the labels we're throwing at them, you forget that there's a man under there, with petty jealousies and insecurity, and sometimes he's in a bad mood, or, you know what I mean? It's like you lose the person, I think, if you use that language.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of reduces everybody and everything to the same level. And once it's in the hands of advertisers and media and people who want to big up whatever it is they're doing, then it just everything becomes iconic. Iconic building, iconic hamburger, iconic pizza, iconic, footballer, whatever it is, like, what the hell? It's utterly devalued. And so, it reduces the Beatles in a sense to the same level as, I don't know, whoever, whatever other artist is iconic. So, no, it's not about that. It's about just understanding the storyline. That's really what it's about, and recognizing human beings and their decision making and their creativity and the sometimes extraordinary connections that people can have in their lives.
Right, absolutely. Let's talk about Liverpool a bit. As I told you when we last met, I'm recently enamored of Liverpool. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I was absolutely struck by the magnitude of Beatles tourism going on in that city. I mean, it seems like everywhere you look, someone's hawking something to do with the Beatles. There's a tour being offered. Which is paradise, if you're a Beatles nut like me. But you said something very interesting in our last meeting. You said that, if I recall correctly, that really started to take off in the years following John Lennon's murder. I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about your relationship to the city and how you've seen that city change over the years.
I first went there in 1977. And it was a pretty sad place to be. Liverpool has had an arm's length and usually quite hostile relationship with central government in the United Kingdom, in England particularly. It's always been treated badly. It's always been the last in the queue, the last in the line to get whatever help a struggling industrial city needs. And the story in Tune In is essentially, it's a 20th century Liverpool story that goes up to 1962, in which the city really has some quite desperate times in terms of unemployment and poverty and standard of living, quality of housing, and so on. And when I went there in 77, it was in the midst of another of those bad downturns. And the Cavern had been knocked down in 1973, only 4 years earlier. And I longed to go in the Cavern. And it was bloody well gone. I mean, how utterly ludicrous that a city would demolish something as important as that so quickly after it had all happened.
It seems absolutely insane in retrospect.
It was insane and needless as well. It was needless in the moment of its plan, because an alternative could have been found if there was a desire for it to be found. But B, I'm not even sure that once the thing was demolished, I'm not even sure that it was found to have been necessary. So it was going through a bad time, and I was young and inexperienced and fearful of things I didn't know. And, you know, it was a city where you could get beaten up if you looked at someone in the wrong way, or so it seemed. That was the reputation that it had. So I kept myself very quiet and together on my first few trips to Liverpool, but eventually began to explore it more boldly when I was writing my first book, The Beatles Live, because it was a list of all the live engagements the Beatles had had from the Quarrymen Skiffle Group onwards. And that meant a lot of knocking on doors and seeing what papers people had. And I went to Liverpool a lot then and got progressively more comfortable with it. But it really maximized when I was doing Tune In, because I went there so often, something like 25, 26 times, often for a week at a time. And I developed a network of friends there, to the extent now where no trip to Liverpool is complete without seeing A, without seeing B, without seeing, you know, if you're in town, go and see them. So the city now is a place where I have no fear. I walk and take photographs because I like taking architectural photography in all the areas whose names are associated with fear. I walk in the Dingle, I walk in Toxteth, I walk in Old Swan, I walk in Everton, I walk in Anfield, I walk in Birkenhead, I walk in Walton and Gattaca, and I walk in Garston, and all these places where you used to read about, you know, fights and so on. And undoubtedly in the period when the Beatles were growing up, it was a risky, edgy place to be. I don't find that anymore. And I really do enjoy going there, and I observe it as well as an outsider. And undoubtedly, it's had to embrace its Beatles connections to a degree that actually is more than many of its citizens would want. Because the citizens have a delightfully Scouse view of things, which very much informed the way the Beatles thought about life. And I mean, for example, my research for Volume 2 tells me that by the time we get to 1965, 66, the Beatles were pretty strongly disliked in Liverpool, and became aware of how strong that was through a number of newspaper pieces that were pointed out to them or that they read, and things that they heard from family members and so on. They were kind of hated up there, believe it or not, whilst being loved everywhere else. It was Liverpool switched on them because there were a variety of complicated psychological reasons that I'm going to have to explain. And that kind of was maintained, which is why the Cavern got knocked down, because it wasn't deemed to have had any value.
That's interesting.
1973.
Yeah, because now, I mean, you know, you fly into John Lennon International Airport, and I was thinking about the economic impact that band must have had on the city over the years. I mean, I'm sure it's incalculable. You can't imagine how much revenue that the band has probably brought in for the city. And just continuing on this theme for a moment, but also speaking a little more generally, when I was walking around Liverpool and visiting some of these sites and seeing, you know, all of the Beatles related activity and vendors and stuff, I started thinking about Elvis, and I started thinking about Graceland. My impression is that the Elvis industry, if we can call it that, is on a downward trajectory. The value of Elvis memorabilia seems to be going down in a lot of cases. There's less, thank God, there's less Elvis impersonation. I love Elvis, but the impersonators, it's a bit much for me. But anyway, it seems to be going down. I think I read, now this could be wrong, I'm fairly certain I read that ticket sales at Graceland actually going down. And I wondered if there's a risk of that happening with the Beatles. Now, it seems to me, you've been around on this rock a hell of a lot longer than me, but it seems to me, even in my own lifetime, it seems that interest is only going up. But do you think there's any risk of that kind of situation of, after the fact Beatlemania, if we can call it that, peaking and then things kind of going down? Do you see any parallels there? What do you think about that?
You can never predict the future, but the logic alone would tell you that in 50, 60 years' time, when no one who experienced the Beatles firsthand is still alive, and therefore all appreciation or knowledge of them is in the hands of subsequent generations, that it will shift. It has to shift, and how it shifts is the unknown factor. But it will have to shift to some extent in some direction or other, and it could be down. It might just be strong in a different way. But one would have expected it. The thing is, one would have expected it to have diminished by now.
Right.
And as you say, it appears not to be diminishing. It appears only to be holding its ground or even gaining ground. So that could never have been predicted. So the prediction business is a risky one. I mean, I take the listener of this back to 1956, where all the predictions were that this rock music, this rock and roll, will be gone tomorrow. And when the Beatles came up, it will be, the question they were asked so often at press conferences and in not just then, but interviews of all kinds, was, when will the bubble burst? When is this thing going to finish? What will you be doing next year? What do you plan to be doing? And on that basis, it's clearly something that there's not a lot of value to be gained from trying to predict tomorrow.
Absolutely.
But there will have to be a shift. There will have to be a shift of some kind. And if you wanted a prediction, as ludicrous as it might be, or it might turn out to be, I can see them. They are the 20th century's Shakespeare. They're bigger than Shakespeare. Sorry, monks. I didn't mean it. They are bigger than Shakespeare in the sense that they're more popular than Shakespeare. More people know their words than they do Shakespeare's words. Shakespeare didn't write such great melodies. Shakespeare's haircut wasn't quite so good. And all of this. They are the 20th century's ultimate cultural contribution to the human race, and therefore they have their place forever. And that's, in a sense, why I'm writing these books. Another reason why I'm writing these books, because if they are to be read about and considered in a couple of 100 years' time, if mankind is still on this planet, let them read something that gets it truthfully right. And let their knowledge be based on accuracy rather than inaccuracy, because that will be the best understanding that people could ever have of how amazing all this was.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right. For me, I don't think it's overstating things to say, to draw parallels with Mozart and Beethoven. Like, is interest in Mozart's operas going down? Well, I'd say no. Is interest in Beethoven's symphonies going down? No. And we're talking 200-300 years after the fact.
Yeah, they're not. But I would add to that sentence, as well as agreement, I would add to that sentence that Beethoven and Mozart are still kind of some kind of an elite preference or an elite enjoyment. It's not the man in the street. They don't really. They could go and sing you a Beatles song, but they couldn't necessarily give you one of Mozart's works. They know he's a composer. They probably know he was brilliant because they've read it, or it's in the common knowledge. But the Beatles are actually still within people in a deep way. So that's why I'm equating Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is, absolutely established as the benchmark for century upon century, and will be for as long as we're here. But how much of the work do people really know? And lots of people do, of course, millions. But I'm talking about percentage of population. So yeah, it is extraordinary how long it's lasted. But one of the reasons I think is because, well, it's all of they're still big for all the reasons that they became big in the first place, which was that they were fresh and bright and young and exciting and innovative, and they made sounds that engaged the human ear that the human ear had never heard before, and that still maintains somehow. Who knew the music could be so good for so long?
Yeah, well said. I'm looking at a question I have written down for you, and the question is, what are some of the things you think people often get wrong about the Beatles? What are the main narratives you're trying to challenge? And you can take that question however you want, but I realize when it really comes down to it, I want to talk about Yoko. The one that pisses me off the most is, the one that pisses me off the most is, I mean, if you read, which I don't advise, by the way, but if you read YouTube comments, Yoko still gets a lot of hate from Beatles fans. You're the devil woman, the witch who broke up the Beatles. And some comments that are far, far worse than that. I don't see that at all. I think at the end of the day, you've got 4 extraordinarily interesting, extraordinarily strong personalities in one little collective. Something's going to break sooner or later. I think it's not fair at all to lay the breakup of the Beatles at Yoko's feet. What do you think about the breakup of the Beatles? Does that narrative kind of get under your skin as well?
Pretty much all the narratives about the Beatles get under my skin. I think almost all of them are wrong, wrong-headed, to use the old-fashioned phrase. I think increasingly, I'm speaking into 2018, but increasingly in the past 5 years, the more knowledge I've acquired, the more I've realized how the general knowledge is not right, and the assumptions built on that knowledge can therefore not be right. And I go back to what I've said about Tune In, because it's true for the entire project, which is I didn't set out to dispel any myths. I simply set out to start again with writing this history. And in so doing, hundreds of myths just kind of fell away. And that will certainly be the case for books 2 and 3. I don't think that people understand the Beatles very well as people. I think their work has been studied to an enormous degree, and with that has come obviously deep inquiry into the lives of these people. And in terms of detail, we have a lot. But in terms of understanding, I think we're light. And I intend to address that one full on. In doing so, Yoko becoming the love of John's life will become much more as it was for the reader, and how it was natural. It was a man meeting a woman. It was an artistic soul meeting another artistic soul and finding a soulmate. And it was an extraordinarily creative performer in John Lennon, a mind that was really most unlike anybody else's, with few exceptions. I mean, in the Beatles, he had his peers, but not many people in life think or thought like John Lennon, any more than they did about the same you could say for Paul and George and Richie. And that is that when he met Yoko Ono, he met someone who utterly inspired him. He met someone who liberated his artistry in a way that he wanted it to go. And her effect on the Beatles is obviously one that needs to be looked at. But let there be no doubt that she was there at John Lennon's request, insistence. If he had said, "Don't come to the session tonight because it's going to upset the others," she wouldn't have gone. And she was not inserting herself into this. She was there at his bidding, and he could see the effect that her presence was having on their chemistry, and didn't stop it. It was something that they would have to adjust to, he thought. And indeed, an adjustment was made. And it was one of a great many things that you could tip into the hat of why did the Beatles break up, but it isn't the only one.
Right. And I think when people say that too, it's pretty insulting to John. I mean, there's the implication that he had no agency there, which, as you suggest, is absolutely wrong.
Yes, it's like, I love you, John Lennon, but I hate the woman who you called the love of your life.
Right. Doesn't quite.
Well, that's a strange one, right?
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. The internet is everybody in the world having the right to broadcast.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And you know, you can see a comment and become freaked by it. And of course, there is massive amount of hatred, a massive amount of racism and bile and vitriol of all kinds, all horrifying, really. And it certainly includes attacks on other individuals.
Absolutely.
I mean, and Yoko gets it. Yoko gets it. But, you know, if you attack her, you're attacking John.
Do you read your critics? Do you engage with some of the negativity that comes your way?
Well, engage with it. I don't get much negativity, I'm pleased to say. I get a lot of positivity, which I really do appreciate. I mean, the work I do and the books I do are such overwhelmingly strong positive forces, in the sense of that is, you know, I'm looking to project positivity, not to the extent of changing the story, but I do believe in glass half full. And so the books generally are well received because people tune into the positivity. You know, Albert Goldman, and I don't mean to malign the man's reputation any more than others already have, but it's an interesting thing. I'm sidetracking myself here. I've had the opportunity to go through Albert Goldman's research notes. And Albert Goldman, who had a reputation for dishing the dirt on the subjects of his biographies, was a much more impressive researcher than I ever realized, and really extraordinarily thorough in the way he went about his work. But then he used that material in a single dimension, and so those books are negative for me, and my books are positive in that it's got both sides, you know, positive and negative. I'm slightly twisting myself with words there, but I know what I mean. So where exactly did that question begin?
I was just curious. I guess it's on my mind. I was just watching an interview with the rapper Kanye West, which was quite entertaining, but he was basically saying that he doesn't really engage much with the negativity. And I've heard a lot of other people say that as well, where they just, artists and authors and creative people, they just won't read the negative comments.
So I get very few negative comments, but when I do, I just disregard them, or I shout at them or something like that, and then I move on. Right. Then they're not going to affect me. But really, there are a few of them. Most of the negative comments I get are people who think I'm in some way dragging my heels in writing this project, you know, this 3-volume history. But that's just, they don't know. That's as simple as that. They don't know.
So my last question, I'd like to ask you a question about writing. In my last interview with you, when we were talking in the British Library, I asked you a question about interviewing, and you gave some very useful tips about how to conduct better interviews, especially face-to-face interviews. I'm looking at you now in what I assume to be your office, mountains of books behind you, and I'm thinking about the absolute mountains of research and documents and files and photographs and all of the research you compiled, for example, for Tune In, for the first volume of your biography. What is your process like when you actually sit down to write? Do you have any best practices? Do you schedule certain hours of the day every day? What is your writing process like when you actually sit down to put pen to paper, so to speak?
I've been in the gathering stage for a very long time on this project, and it's, as I've mentioned, it's still pouring in at such a rate and of such a quality that I need to allow it still. Well, in fact, I'm never going to stop it, but I need to make that my main focus. The next step will be looking at everything I have, assimilating all of it, and making a structure from it, putting together a series of documents that enclose all the information that will be useful to me when I'm writing this chapter or that year, or whatever it might be. The whole of the next book will have a framework, and it will have an order of things in that I'll go from that to that to that to that to that. In any one chapter, there might be 200 touch points that I need to include that. I need to include that. I will order them in such a way, and I did this with Tune In as well. I will order them in such a way that the out of one becomes the in of the next one so seamlessly that the reader doesn't realize it. And the Beatles story and the way that I'm able to analyze the information that I've found is just such that one can do that. It can actually be done. So I'll have natural bridges that go from each of the sub-subjects to the next one. And at the end of all of that, I will write it. And in the writing, I'll see the areas where I need to go away and dig a little bit more, or I think I've got something on this somewhere I need to go and find things that you can't anticipate that you will need. But in the moment of creativity, then you realize what it needs to work. And then I will write the chapter. And that could take anything, depends how long it is. Some chapters are short and some are long. And the long ones take little time sometimes, and the short ones can take a long time. But at the end of each Friday, at the end of each Monday to Friday writing period, I will print out the work. I will take a red pen to it, and over the weekend I will mark it up, cross things out, move things around, introduce more levity into the text if it's required. And then I will implement those red marks into a revision, and I will keep revising. I'm not the kind of writer who goes back and makes mass changes, but one of the ramifications of writing a story in this linear fashion is that you realize when writing chapter 15 that you'd better go and make a change to chapter 2 where that person is introduced, because you need to accommodate the knowledge that we're going to have later. So there's a lot of that kind of fine tuning that goes on, but I don't do mass rewrites, and then it's printed out and it's done.
Is there a reason why you physically print it out and actually have that tactile element, like actually holding it in your hands? Why not do that in the computer?
Oh, I mean, one is endlessly proofing on computer anyway, but there's something about seeing it on paper. Maybe it's my age, but I do think that if anyone listening to this is a writer, I would recommend printing out and reading it. Go into another room, go and sit in the garden, go and have a pint of beer, whatever it might be. Just go and sit with a pen in some other place, and you will see things that need changing or don't need changing, as the case may be, in a new way. I think editing on screen is second to printing out and reading on paper.
Yeah, I think that's
in all disciplines.
Yeah.
By the same token, if I have an important approach I need to make to somebody, I will write a letter, a real letter, print it out on paper, put it in an envelope, and post it. And I think it carries a lot more weight than an email.
I completely agree.
There are times when a real letter in 2018 still packs a punch. It's something that people open and they've got it on their desk and they put it to one side and then there it is again. They look at it again. They can show it to someone. I think it has a lot of weight.
Absolutely. I've kept every single physical letter I've ever received. I cannot say the same about every email I've received. And postcards. People love postcards, even in 2018. I mean, it really means a lot to people. You know, it's nice. We miss that sort of tactile experience with words.
Yeah, I keep a box of postcards right by my desk here, and occasionally I'll just fish one out and scribble it and send it off to somebody. It could be a joke, it could be anything. And the Beatles story is full of postcards. Loads of postcards. I mean, Ringo did a book, Postcards from the Boys, in which he reproduced the postcards he'd received and kept from John, George and Paul. And how illuminating they are to look at now. You know, a major contribution Ringo made to our history and our understanding of it, right there with that book. Which is why I say I'm more interested in seeing what they've got than what they remember. Because if he just showed me a box of postcards and they hadn't been in the book, they would all tell me something important.
And if I recall correctly, there's a funny story associated with that. Like, he just found this box of postcards and negatives, I think, in like a random box in his house or something like that. Like, it was almost lost forever.
I think it was his mother. I think Elsie kept it. He also did the second book with all that stuff as well, Photograph. And there was a Grammy Museum exhibition in Los Angeles with that stuff. So I'm all for that. I think it's high time that the Beatles did an exhibition, a great exhibition. You know, we've had the Bowie one, we've had the Stones one, we've got, in this country, we've got the Jam is touring at the moment as an exhibition. My goodness, the Beatles should have an exhibition.
Absolutely, because there's so much cool memorabilia and stuff associated with them.
Massive amounts. And I'd love to see them open up their stuff. You know, I mean, when we were on the anthology, there was still some politics going on. We were asked, I say we, it was George Martin, but I was pushing him to ask them to open up what they've got. You know, if you've got acetates and if you've got tapes, this is the project, please share them. But there was still the stuff of, well, I'll give one if he gives one. And, you know, if he gives one, I won't give two. And, you know, these things happen. It's their lives, you know, it's not just some historian asking for something. It's their lives, it's their relationships, and I understand that. But, yeah, I think it's time. I want it all out now. Let's get everything out there. Every single thing should be out there and available now. And my entire archive will become publicly available sometime.
Oh, wow.
I'm fully intent on that. Yeah. It's not, I mean, I'm learning, but it isn't for me to hang on to. It belongs to everybody. It belongs to those who wish to look at it.
Yeah. Well, I hope I don't have to tell you if there's anything I can do to help with that project. I hope you'll let me know, because that would be amazing. That'd be really great.
Well, if anybody listening to this is interested, I'm open to applications from libraries, from university, academic places. I'm open to any free thinking. I'm open to free thinking on how the Beatles and all popular music can be curated into a working repository of information and archive and enjoyment. And the thing about that would be, because I have so much that is directly from the Beatles. I have, you know, tens of thousands of recordings, of interviews, of video, of film, of letters and contracts and everything like that. And if it's the truth that, and it is, of course, that the artist wants to communicate with the public directly with as few filters in between as possible, then putting all this stuff into a place where people can hear it in times to come will be the ultimate, really, because it means that someone won't be quoting somebody else talking about Paul McCartney. They can go and listen to Paul McCartney's own voice and have it directly from him. He won't be dead in that respect. None of them will be. None of this can be. And this is true for everybody in culture, basically, but certainly the Beatles, this archive is vast. And it should be out there. I'm using it now for the writing of these books, but when I'm done, it's everybody's.
Yeah, well, I'll await that with eager anticipation. That sounds absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
Mark, thank you so much.
Anyone listening? I'll just say, anyone listening to this who has an idea that might further that, someone with some funding, someone with a building, please come forward.
And what's the best way to get in touch with you on that note?
I have a website that is just so atrocious I never even look at it. I mean, it's a deep embarrassment to me. I haven't updated it ever since the moment it went live in 2013. But it's www.marklewison.net. If somebody out there wants to give me a better website, I'll listen to that idea as well. I want to start putting content up there. I want to, but I haven't got time. I'm writing books, so there's only a limit to how much I can do. But there is an address on that, and so if you go to www.marklewison.net, because somebody took the .com and didn't use it, thank you. It's .net. Then there is an email address through there, and I can be reached.
Excellent. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being so generous with your time over the past couple of weeks. It really means a lot to me, and thank you for making time for me today. This was great.
A pleasure, a complete pleasure.
Well, there you have it. One of my favorite people to talk to, Mr. Mark Lewison. Again, his website is marklewison.net. His very ugly website, apparently. It's not that bad. I looked it up. I don't think it's that bad. And his book is called Tune In, The Beatles, All Those Years. Be sure to pick up that book if you haven't already for a real treat. Thank you so much for listening. It's so great to be doing this again. I can't tell you how much I missed podcasting, and it's nice to finally get out of my own way and be launching episodes again. A quick reminder that if you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like me to keep making new episodes, please go to iTunes, be sure you subscribe, and leave a rating and a review. And another reminder that you can find information about everything we talked about in today's episode. You can find links and show notes and bonus content at humansinlove.com. Thanks again for listening, guys. Be sure to have yourself an absolutely fantastic day, night, afternoon, weekend, early morning, hungover Sunday. Whenever you're listening to this, I hope it's really good. And remember that life is short, so enjoy yourself. I'll talk to you again very soon.